So with the release of Battle Partners over in Japan, Japan have had their rotation, and it's been a week, almost a week, probably over a bit of a week, depends what time this video comes out, and the meta has already changed quite a bit. Obviously decks that have survived a rotation and like not lost a whole lot of support are still pretty good. We have Dragapult, Raging Bolt, Charizard, Goldengo, Archlodon, even Gardevoir still relevant. All those decks are still doing pretty well. One deck has just come out of nowhere. This deck used to be a thing and it was like known, but it didn't really do that well. However, with the rotation, it suddenly shot up to being a very good deck. We all know about control decks. We'll meet the post-rotation control deck, Milotic EX. This is a 270 HP water type Pokemon with the Sparkling Scales ability that says prevent all damage from and effects of attacks of your opponent's Terra Pokemon done to this Pokemon. So what that basically means is it cannot take damage from attacks from Terra Pokemon, just in general. If you're playing a Terra deck and your main attacker is a Terra Pokemon, like Dragapult, like Charizard, like Celeridge, this card will not take any damage. And if that Pokemon has a secondary effect of the attack, for example, Dragapult can put 6 damage counters on your opponent's benched Pokemon, Milotic, again, is immune. But you may be wondering, what if you go up against a deck that isn't playing, Terra Pokemon? What if you're against something like Raging Bolt, whose main attacker is Raging Bolt? What if you're against Archlodon? What if you're against Goldengo? What if you're against Gardevoir? Well, this deck is pretty much a control toolbox, because it will play anything and everything it can to basically make sure your opponent is not taking prizes and not dealing any damage. Some lists play Noivern EX, which says that during your opponent's next turn, you can prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from basic Pokemon. So it already covers basic Pokemon. It also plays for Vigorously EX, which with its Armored Tail ability prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from basic Pokemon EX. So we're covered in 2 ways. And then of course Cornerstone Mask Ogabon, which says prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by Pokemon that have an ability. So you are pretty much covered in 3 different ways. Milotic can't be damaged by Terra Pokemon, so if you're up against a Terra deck, you play this. If you're up against a basic EX deck, you play for Vigorously, and if you're up against a deck that plays Pokemon with abilities, you play Cornerstone Mask Ogapon. Not to mention the plethora of other control Pokemon we have in the format, like Mimikyu, Klefki, all those kind of things. This deck just has a counter for pretty much every deck in the format. Not to mention that the attacks of these Pokemon are actually pretty decent. Milotic requires 1 water and 2 colorless, does 160 damage, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now asleep. Asleep prevents the Pokemon from retreating, as in you can't manually detach to retreat, you have to use a switching card, and you flip a coin to see if you wake up. For Redraft does 160 damage and then 30 damage to the bench for 1 psychic and 2 colorless. And then Cornerstone Mask Ogapon does 140 damage for 1 fighting, 2 colorless, and its damage isn't affected by weakness or resistance. The main thing you may notice is that they only require 1 of a specific type. So because of this, you pretty much only need to play like 3 fighting, 3 psychic, and 3 water with a few copies of Crispin, which allows you to get 2 different energy types from the deck, attach one to one of your Pokemon, and add the other to your hand. However, another thing you may notice is that it's free attack cost, and that is going to take a little bit of time to get going, but that's why the decks play Turbo Energize. Because if you have one of these Pokemon in the active, depending on the deck, your opponent isn't going to be able to attack you. Especially if you have something like Mimikyu in the active, which just prevents all damage done to it by EX Pokemon, which is pretty much the only rulebox type of Pokemon we're going to be having in the format. So you attach Turbo Energize and then Energy, and then you use it to attach 2 basic energy cards from your deck to one of your benched Pokemon in any way you like. So you can easily get your other Pokemon powered up. And since you don't need to bench all 3, you can see what the matchup is and then bench the specific one that you may need. For example, if you're against Dragapult, you can just bench Milotic and Feebas. You don't need to worry about Farigiraf or Cornerstone Mask because Dragapult can easily attack through them. If you're up against something like Charizard, you can focus both Milotic and Cornerstone Mask, since Charizard is a Terra and it has an ability. If you're up against something like Archlodon, then again, you can focus just on Cornerstone Mask Ogapon, so on and so forth. You basically kind of try and pick and play whatever you can depending on the matchup, but obviously if you draw a specific one that you don't need against the matchup in your opening hand and you have to put it in the active, that's just a little bit of a downside. If you know what you're up against, then you can play just what you need to deal with that matchup. Some lists are also playing different cards in the trainers list. I've seen some lists playing Hero's Cape to increase the HP of their Pokemon Pokemon. I've seen some playing Pokevital A, which I think heals like 150 damage. Some lists are playing Rigid Band, so your stage 1 Pokemon take 30 less damage, very good when given to for Regidrath and Milotic. Town Store to get any of your tool cards, because this deck kind of does rely on Turbo Energize and also TM Evolution to get itself going, and stuff like Rigid Band to protect itself. Some lists are also playing Counter Gain, so if you're behind on the game, you can reduce the cost of your attacks by 1, which is pretty helpful. Some lists are also playing Mist Energy, so you can attach it to your Cornerstone Mask or your Ferigidrath EX to basically give them protection from effects of attacks as well. So if you're up against something like Roaring Moon, they can't one-hit KO and Dragapult can't put 60 on them. This deck pretty much has every tool it needs to combat every deck in the format currently. But obviously decks will be playing ways to play around these types of matchups, because it has 3 to 4 different Pokemon that it plays. Depending on the matchup, you are obviously going to have instances where you don't draw the one that you need. Say you're up against Dragapult, you accidentally, get a Ferigidrath going first, that's just an easy prize knockout. And plus you also have, other stuff going around the format. Dusknoir is very good at like pinging a bunch of damage, which is why at the moment it's only a tier 2 deck. That's mainly because of how much it's seen play, but obviously we're only in the first week of the new rotation, so players are still tinkering around with what's best for each of these decks and what the optimal builds will be. However, my main question is, why did this deck become so prominent after rotation? Because this deck has been around pre-rotation and it has done decently well, but it just hasn't done as well as it has done, recently. And I think that's just because of how powerful some of the decks we had and do still have in our rotation. Obviously you have stuff like Regidrago, which is just ridiculously powerful. Kyurem is a card, so it can easily just take out 3 of your benched Pokemon, because Milotic and Ferigidrath need to evolve. Lugia can just play a plethora of, different Pokemon to deal with it. It has, basic Pokemon without abilities. It has, non-Roblox Pokemon that can attack with. Snorlax Stall is also a deck that kind of just counters the deck entirely. Cloth was also a deck at the time that could probably deal very well with it. If you guys know in the comments why this deck didn't really see the level of success it did pre-rotation, then let me know. But post-rotation, this deck is probably going to see quite a lot of play in the format. And this is probably going to be our new control toolbox style deck that we're going to have to learn to deal with. Because no matter what deck you're playing, it will have a counter and a way to just prevent you from attacking and doing damage and taking prize cards and all that kind of stuff. And then it can slowly whittle you away. Because that is another downside with this deck, is that it is a little bit slow. It does need to evolve, and its attacks are free energy cost, with the only way to really accelerate energy into play is with stuff like Crispin. So the deck is a little bit slow. That might be another reason why it didn't really see play, because the current decks in the format are pretty fast. But that is one of the downsides of the deck and the many other downsides. But it is still a pretty interesting deck and a pretty powerful deck at that, depending on what other type of control Pokemon we get in the future could be splashed into the deck, and it could become even better than it already is. And that is it for this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, what you think about this Milotic EX Toolbox control deck. Are you thinking of playing this deck? Do you already play this deck in our current format? How are you finding it? Do you think it has a chance to shine post-rotation? Do you think it has a chance to shine at the rest of the events we have currently until our rotation? But do keep in mind that Battle Partners is only part of our set for Journey Together, so when we get Journey Together, we're also going to have Battle Partners as well as what other set is going to be combined with that, because we also have the Steven and Marnie's decks. They're going to be part of Journey Together, so our meta is going to be a little bit different than what Japan is currently, because we're going to have 2 sets worth in our 1 set, if you know what I mean. So there could be new cards released that, completely change the format than what it currently is, but it's worth talking about what's currently good, just so we can gauge how our format may look come April. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, all of that nonsense, and I will see you in the next video, whatever that may be. Take care.